So, Eversion by Alastair Reynolds. Alastair Reynolds is my favorite sci-fi author, I would have to say. Love his books. Anyways, this one I'm going chapters 1 to 6, or 1 to 5, which I think are sort of the first time loop. So basically this just starts early 1800s. The back of the book says in the 1800s. It's not in the early 18th century, early 1700s, because one of the characters references Peter the Great and Catherine, assumably Catherine the First. So that's like 1710s, 1720s. 1710s or 20s. There's a ship voyage. They're heading up the north coast of Norway, looking for a certain fissure through which they will enter a lagoon, and on this lagoon is an edifice, they call it, this massive sprawling castle building that's like 250 yards in diameter and also in height, which once that part was mentioned it felt very Lovecraftian to me. Sort of this cyclopean edifice, they keep using the word edifice, that they don't really know anything about, and is it abandoned, is it not? Anyways, so that's sort of the plot. They're heading towards this. They enter the fissure. As they do, they see a wrecked ship, and it's revealed that the person who gave them the information about this edifice knew that the ship was wrecked, but didn't tell them. So then they go in, and their ship gets wrecked, and our prospective character, Dr. Silas Code, part of the mast falls on and breaks his spine, and he assumedly dies. And that's the first 5 chapters. Chapter 6 starts the exact same way chapter 1 starts, so I'm sensing it's a time loop thing, but not like a Groundhog Day or Window of Opportunity time loop. This is sort of a time loop where, because the back of the book says so, 1800s followed by 1900s followed by Spaceship in the Far Future. So it's sort of the same events happening over and over again, but in different periods of time, but with the same characters. And I think our main character, Dr. Silas Code, realizes this, because in these first 5 chapters he's writing a book, and in this book he's writing essentially follows, unintentionally, it follows the same narrative as what is happening in this book. Like he's writing about a voyage and about discovering something and about a horrible end that they'll all experience, which is what happens. But what he's writing is he's sort of writing a sci-fi, because he's writing in the 1710s, but he's writing about steamships, cameras. There's something else that he mentions, like sort of, which all seem like fanciful sci-fi stuff at the 1710s, but we know in 100 or 200 years in the future, they all are technologies that exist. And there's also a period in the book when one of the characters, they're talking about the fissure, and one of the characters mishears it as fission. He says something about fission, and Dr. Silas Code says, no, fission is something certainly different, which makes me think nuclear fission. I'm like, how does this guy know about nuclear fission? So at first I was like, is this sort of he's either a time traveler from the future, Dr. Silas Code, which is why he could write about cameras and steam engines and whatnot before they're invented, or this is sort of a construct. This reality is a simulation set in the 1710s, and Silas Code is a denizen of the far-flung future who's in this sort of holodeck version of reality, living out this thing. Or it's some weird time thing. I mean, the cover Eversion has sort of a weird time-dilated or space-dilated, kind of like a black hole sort of thing, if you think of Interstellar, when it all goes wibbly-wobbly by the black hole. Anyways, the title Eversion, at one point Silas blacks out, and when he comes to, part of his story that he'd crumpled up has been straightened out, and written on it is inversion, inversion, eversion. And like the inversion has been crossed out, and then the bottom is just this eversion. So it's like he's trying to tell himself something, which I think he's experiencing these time loops, and he's trying to tell himself to break out of it, but he doesn't sort of remember that he wrote that. But if I know Alastair Reynolds, that's what it'll seem to be. That'll be the plot, and we'll get to the very end, and then the last like 10 pages, it'll be ramped up to 15, and it'll blow my mind, and it'll be totally different, and then we'll resolve. But that's where we're at right now. So he talks about having a dream where he's walking through a smooth stone tunnel, and he's wearing a hood, and at the very end the hood's pulled back and his face is like a skull, and then he wakes up. He mentions that in chapter 1, I think, and then I haven't read chapter 6 yet, but the start of chapter 6 is him having that dream again, and then waking up, and sort of the same thing that had happened in the first 5 chapters seems to be happening again, except this time I think we're in the 1900s instead of the 1720s, early 1900s. So it's very interesting. And it's a very short book too. It's only 300 pages. Oh, it's like a normal book, which Calvin and Sylvester. What is this extras at the end of the book? Oh, Revelation Space. Also a good book. You should check those out. Yeah, so very interesting. Very interesting. It feels like a period piece, but it's also set in the future. I think. There's another part when he mentions he's trying to explain something about the ship, and he says unless you've solved genetics. Oh, I should have looked this up beforehand because it was really funny, because he mentions sort of 3 things that would be considered mysteries to sort of a man of science of the 1720s. He's like, unless you can explain to me those, then I'm not interested. Oh yeah, if you had resolved the riddle of heredity of physiognomy, which is like genetics, or devised a lens for discerning bone through living tissue, X-ray, or shown me how to render a patient insensible to the agony of surgery, anesthetic, I might be moved in the manner you expect. So there's like 3 things that are all solved in our current time, but he specifically picks those 3. It's like he has knowledge of the future. So my thinking is he's stuck in a time loop where he's experiencing the same events through different periods in time, somehow, or something. And that's just the first 5 chapters.